Sometime in the middle of the 1980s, behind a shuttered brick factory on Main Street in Springfield, Massachusetts, a century of engineering drawings went into a dumpster. Blueprints for milling machines that cut the steel of two world wars. Drawings for the boring bars that rebuilt the engines of the American automobile age. The working memory of a company that once ranked among the 10 largest machine tool builders in the United States, hauled out with the trash. The company was called Van Norman. It was founded by watchmakers, carried by immigrants, defended by one of the most radical unions in American labor history, and broken by a New York raider who promised to build the General Motors of the machine tool industry. The machines survived. The company did not. This is how 100 years of American precision ended up in a dumpster. You are watching Trade Archive, where the companies that built the physical world get the documentary treatment they earned. If that sounds like your kind of history, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Now, back to 1874. Waltham, Massachusetts, 1874. The town is the beating heart of the American watch industry, and the Waltham watch factories are performing a kind of industrial magic that most of the world still considers impossible. They are mass-producing pocket watches with interchangeable parts, gears and pivots, and balance staffs machined so precisely that a part from one watch drops into another without hand-fitting. To do that kind of work, you need tools that are more precise than the parts they make. And that is the business. A Canadian immigrant named Caleb Hopkins Van Norman decided to enter when he founded the Hopkins Watch Tool Company. The Van Normans made watchmakers' lathes, small, jewel-like machines that sat on a workbench and turned parts measured in 10,000ths of an inch, the kind of tolerance a machinist calls a tenth. A human hair is about 30 times thicker. The men who ran these lathes worked under skylights with loops in their eyes, and the lathes themselves were driven by leather belts descending from overhead line shafts that spun from one end of the shop to the other. In that world, a bearing with the slightest looseness ruined everything downstream. The family learned precision at the smallest scale American industry had to offer, and they never unlearned it. In 1883, the family picked up the name of the Waltham Watch Tool Company, a name that had come free when the original firm of that name pivoted into watch production. Caleb's sons organized the reorganized company. Edmund F. Van Norman and Frederick D. Van Norman ran the operation, and in 1888, a third brother, Charles E. Van Norman, joined the firm. Charles would become the engineering mind of the family, the name on the patents, and eventually the president who steered the company for decades. Their bench lathes competed with the best makers in New England, firms like Stark and Pratt and Whitney, and by the end of the century, their machines were winning export orders from watchmaking customers in England and Switzerland, markets that did not hand out compliments to American tool makers. But watch tools were a small pond, and the family could see a bigger one 100 miles west. In 1890, the company moved to Springfield, Massachusetts, into the industrial corridor along the Connecticut River that historians would later call Precision Valley. Springfield was the natural home for a family obsessed with tolerances. The Springfield Armory on the hill above the city had pioneered interchangeable parts manufacturing for the United States military, and the valley around it had filled with foundries, forge shops, and machine builders staffed by the deepest pool of skilled machinists in the country. The same year they arrived, the Van Normans designed and built their first milling machine. It was a decisive turn away from the watchmaker's bench and toward heavy industrial iron, and the milling machines sold. By 1896, the firm was known for its duplex millers, and in 1912, the operation was formally incorporated as the Van Norman Machine Tool Company, with a plant on Main Street in Springfield's North End, next door to the sprawling American Bosch Works. Charles Van Norman settled into a comfortable colonial revival house in the city's McKnight neighborhood, a short ride from the factory floor. The company was local, family-run, and rooted. That would matter later. To understand what made Van Norman famous, you have to understand the problem every machine shop in America faced at the turn of the century. Milling machines came in two kinds. A horizontal mill carried its spindle parallel to the floor, mounted long arbor cutters, and hogged metal off a workpiece with tremendous rigidity. A vertical mill carried its spindle straight down like a drill press, and it excelled at face milling, drilling, and cutting pockets and slots. A serious job shop needed both operations, which meant buying two expensive machines, giving up twice the floor space, and worst of all, moving the workpiece between them. Every time a machinist unbolted a casting from one table and clamped it to another, he had to re-indicate the part from scratch, sweeping a dial indicator across its surfaces to realign it. Every move was a chance to introduce error into work that was supposed to be perfect. Van Norman's answer was the ram-type milling machine, and it was the kind of solution that looks obvious only after someone else has done it. The cutter head rode on a heavy cast-iron ram that slid forward and back across the top of the machine's column, and the head itself swiveled on a massive trunnion. To run horizontal work, the machinist slid the ram back, rotated the head to its stop, and mounted an arbor supported by an overarm. To run vertical work, he cranked the ram forward and swung the head 90 degrees down. The changeover took a minute or two. No second machine, no second setup, no re-indicating the part. The company hammered that advantage in the pages of American Machinist, advertising a mill that did the work of many single-purpose machines and cut the idle time of the man running it. The design bred a whole family of machines. Small ram mills like the number 6 served tool rooms, laboratories, and repair shops. At the far end of the line stood the number 38, a 9,000-pound monster built for locomotive and heavy manufacturing work. And in the middle sat the machine that would carry the company's name into legend, the Van Norman number 12. Machinists who ran them will tell you that, pound for pound, a number 12 machine was more rigid than machines twice its size, a compact block of seasoned gray iron that simply refused to chatter. More than 5,000 number 12 machines would eventually be built, most of them during the Second World War, and a remarkable number of them are still cutting metal today. The Van Normans did indulge one stubbornness engineering habit. Rather than adopt the spindle tapers the rest of the industry was standardizing around, they designed their own. The smaller mills took the Van Norman C-taper collet, a design later produced by Harding as the 5V, and the mid-sized machines took the number 2 taper, known today as the 50V. The proprietary collets held tools with excellent concentricity, but they locked every Van Norman owner into tooling nobody else made. Only on the later, larger machines did the company finally conform to the industry's standard tapers. That stubbornness would come back around in a way nobody in Springfield could have predicted, and we will get to that at the end of this story. The ram mill concept was too good to stay in Massachusetts. In Ruhr, Germany, the firm of Gebrüder Thiel, a company that, like Van Norman, had started life-making watches, built its duplex tool room millers around the same convertible logic of a sliding ram and a swiveling head. In Stockholm, Eklunds Mekaniska Verkstad built the Abeni mills on a distinctly similar angled ram. Machinists have argued for decades about who borrowed what from whom, and the honest answer is that the concept proved itself and spread. What is not in dispute is which company put it on American factory floors by the thousands. Then, in 1914, Van Norman quietly built something with consequences far beyond any milling machine. That year, the company introduced its first oscillating grinder, a machine designed to grind the hardened steel races of ball and roller bearings. Charles Van Norman's name went on the grinding patents himself. Before machines like these, American industry leaned on imported bearings, many of them German, which became an uncomfortable dependency the moment the First World War began. Van Norman's grinders helped change that. By the company's own account, its oscillating grinders ended up in the plants of substantially every important ball and roller bearing manufacturer in the world. Precision bearing grinding sounds like an obscure niche. Hold that thought, because half a century later, machines from this exact niche would sit at the center of a Cold War fight over Soviet nuclear missiles. First, though, the company had to survive the 1920s, and it did so by reinventing itself. The machine tool business has always been brutally cyclical. When factories stop buying equipment, machine tool builders starve. So, in 1920, Van Norman opened a second front and began building automotive engine repair equipment, aimed not at factories, but at the tens of thousands of garages and machine shops servicing America's exploding population of automobiles. The engines of that era wore out fast. Dusty roads, primitive oil, and soft cast iron meant that a Model T or an early Chevrolet often needed its engine rebuilt well before the rest of the car gave up. The cylinders wore tapered and oval, the piston rings lost their seal, and the engine started burning oil and losing compression. Fixing it meant boring the cylinders back to perfectly round at an oversized diameter and fitting new pistons. Van Norman built the machine that did it, and they gave it a name a salesman could love: the Perfecto portable boring bar. A mechanic clamped the 100-pound machine directly to the deck of the engine block, centered it in the worn cylinder with a micrometer fixture, set the depth stop, and let the machine feed its carbide cutter down the bore under power. The genius was in a patented detail the company called cat's paws. These were adjustable support shoes arranged around the boring head just above the cutting tool, and as the cutter traveled down the cylinder, the paws rode against the freshly machined wall right behind it. They braced the tool against the work itself, killing the microscopic vibration machinists call chatter, the ripple that ruins a cylinder wall's finish, and, with it, the piston ring seal. A vacuum attachment pulled the abrasive cast iron chips out of the bore as it cut. The Perfecto line ran for decades through model families like the 777, the 900 series, the 944, and the 965, and the company built an entire catalog around it. Valve refacers that ground the sealing angles on valves, brake lathes that trued warped drums, crankshaft grinders that brought worn journals back to round, rotary surface grinders that flattened warped blocks and heads, and flywheel grinders that restored clutch surfaces. By the 1940s, Van Norman's own catalog was calling the company the outstanding manufacturer of equipment in the automotive service industry, and the claim was not far off the mark. It is worth pausing on how these machines were actually made, because the making explains the reputation. Everything started in gray cast iron. Bases, columns, knees, tables, rams, and cutter heads were poured as sand castings, heavy sections of iron chosen precisely because cast iron swallows vibration the way hardwood swallows sound. The ram of a number 12 alone is roughly 200 pounds of iron. The knee adds another 150. Castings were aged to relieve internal stresses, then machined, and then came the part no machine could do. The sliding ways, the surfaces where table moves against saddle and saddle against knee, were finished by hand scraping, a craftsman drawing a scraper across the iron to cut bearing points a few 10,000ths deep, checking his progress against a reference surface smeared with marking blue, over and over, until the surfaces mated with near-perfect contact. Gibs were fitted to set the sliding clearances. It was slow, skilled, stubborn work. Watchmakers' patience applied to half-ton castings, and it is the single biggest reason these machines still hold tolerance 80 years later. The company even secured its own cutting tool supply. In 1946, Van Norman purchased substantially all the stock of the Morse Twist Drill and Machine Company of New Bedford, one of the most storied names in American cutting tools, and ran it as a profitable division. and the precision culture ran deeper than one factory. Next door at American Bosch, craftsmen lapped diesel injection plungers to 39 millionths of an inch. That was the neighborhood Van Norman lived in. The neighborhood also had a temper. The men who ran Van Norman's mills and grinders were organized by the United Electrical, Radio, and Machine Workers of America, the UE, an affiliate of the CIO, and by any measure one of the most militant left-wing unions in American history. The UE didn't organize just the elite tradesmen the old craft unions wanted. It organized wall-to-wall, sweeper to master toolmaker, into one bargaining unit. And it fought management on the issue Springfield machinists cared about most, the stopwatch. Company efficiency men would stand behind a veteran machinist timing every reach and dial turn, building the standard data that fed piece rate incentive systems, pay schemes that effectively punished any man who wouldn't work at a sprint all shift. To craftsmen who thought in tenths, the stopwatch was an insult, and the UE turned that insult into leverage through slowdowns, grievances, and hard bargaining. Even during the war, with a national no-strike pledge in effect, the union's own culture was summed up in a famous line from its shops that they never interpreted, no strike, to mean no struggle. Which brings us to one of the strangest ironies in American industrial history. When the Second World War came, the federal government grew deeply suspicious of the UE's leadership, accusing it of communist sympathies, and in the years after the war, those accusations would tear the Union apart. But in 1942, the same government needed Van Norman desperately. Milling machines were the machines that made the machines. Every tank plant, every aircraft engine line, every arsenal ran on machine tools, and Springfield delivered them. By December 1942, Van Norman employed 2,779 workers, ranking it the 7th largest machine tool builder in the United States by wage earners, ahead of famous names like Guichault and Monarch. The plant ran multiple shifts, 6 days a week, pouring out ram mills and grinders, and the number 12s built in those years went everywhere, including into the machine shops of Navy repair ships. The military marked that kind of performance with the Army-Navy E Award, a pennant and pins granted for excellence in war production to roughly 5% of the more than 85,000 companies doing war work. Van Norman's radical, left-led workforce earned its place among them. Picture that ceremony for a moment. Military brass pinning production honors on the shirts of machinists whose union the government considered politically dangerous because those machinists were building the tools that would beat fascism. Both things were true at once, and nobody on that factory floor saw any contradiction. The war ended, and an era ended with it. Charles E. Van Norman died in 1946, the same year the company bought Morse Twist Drill, still living in the McKnight neighborhood a short distance from the plant he had helped build. For 7 decades, the company had been run by the family and by local engineers who lived in the city, employed its people, and answered to it. What happened next is a textbook case of what replaced that world. After the war, Van Norman was exactly what Wall Street liked: profitable, respected, sitting on cash, and family-held. In 1955, the company made its first move outside its lane, acquiring the Insulin Corporation of America, a maker of radio components. Then, in 1956, a New York industrialist named Herbert Siegel acquired a 35% controlling interest in the company from the descendants of the original owners. Siegel wasted no time. The Springfield area directors were swept off the board. Corporate headquarters left Springfield for New York City. The firm was renamed Van Norman Industries, and Siegel announced his ambition in a phrase that tells you everything about the era. He intended to build the General Motors of the machine tool industry. For a while, it even looked plausible. Van Norman Industries swelled into a conglomerate with factories in California, Michigan, New Hampshire, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, and $51 million in annual sales. The acquisitions had less and less to do with machine tools, radio parts, electromechanical accounting calculators, components for aircraft radar, masonry drills. Capital and management attention that had once gone into milling machine development was now spread across half a dozen unrelated industries. In March 1957, Segal announced the crown jewel, a brand new machine tool factory to be built in Springfield, a public commitment to the city that had built the company. Then, the economy turned. The recession of 1957 hit capital equipment first, as it always does, and machine tool orders collapsed. The Van Norman family had weathered downturns for 80 years by tightening up and holding on. New York held on to nothing. Construction on the new factory was halted. 100 veteran Springfield workers were laid off, and the men who remained were cut to a 4-day week. Sales fell from $51 million to $47. The gleaming new plant was never built. In the space of a single year, the workforce learned exactly what it was now worth to its owners, and the shop floor loyalty that had survived 2 world wars started to die. Wall Street turned on Segal almost as fast as he had turned on Springfield. In early 1958, a group of Chicago investors bought 100,000 shares, took 3 of the 15 board seats, and forced through cost cuts that included a 10% reduction in Segal's own compensation. Before long, Segal was out entirely, replaced by Charles Myers, an executive who had come up through the Morse Twist drill division. Myers actually had a plan worth the name. His integrated design program aimed to leapfrog the company back to the technological front with a numerically controlled grinder, a numerically controlled machine for miniature ball bearings, and a multi-axis drilling machine, exactly the products the next 30 years of manufacturing would demand. The board, locked in a fight over the company's thin profits, killed the program. And with it, as the historian Robert Forant later wrote, went the long-term future of Van Norman in Springfield. The company that had invented its way out of every previous crisis was no longer allowed to invent. From there, the ownership carousel spun faster. In 1962, Van Norman Industries merged into the Universal American Corporation, another sprawling conglomerate. By the end of 1963, half of the Springfield factory's 500 remaining workers were down to a 30-hour week. In the mid-1960s, Universal American was itself swallowed by Gulf and Western Industries, the acquisition machine so notorious for buying and stripping American manufacturers that Wall Street nicknamed it engulf and devour. Springfield was now a line item 4 layers deep in a New York holding company. Employment slid under 300, the lowest in 30 years. The owners, in Forant's words, felt no obligation whatsoever to the valley's workers, managers, and industrial heritage. To wring profit from the aging plant, management doubled down on the stopwatch culture the UE had fought since the 1930s. Incentive systems that metered out a machinist's day down to his fatigue time, and the proud remnants of the workforce answered with the bitterness of men watching their trade be devalued in front of them. 90 miles north of Van Norman's plant, in Springfield, Vermont, stood the Bryant Chucking Grinder Company, the nation's premier builder of precision internal grinders, the machines that finished the insides of bearing races. Bryant machines made the miniature precision bearings that American missile guidance systems and their gyroscopes depended on. In 1960, the Soviet Union, unable to mass-produce such bearings, ordered a batch of Bryant's Centiline B grinders through its trade agency, and the fight over that order exploded into Senate hearings in 1960 and 1961 titled "Export of Ball Bearing Machines to Russia." Congress effectively stopped the shipment. But in 1972, in the era of détente, the sale came back, and this time 45 Bryant precision grinders went east. The researcher Anthony Sutton charged that Defense Department objections were quashed by Henry Kissinger himself, and that the machines helped the Soviets sharpen missile accuracy and field MIRV warheads, multiple independently targeted weapons on a single missile. Kissinger later conceded, at Vladivostok in 1974, that he wished he had thought through the implications of a MIRVed world more carefully. That scandal belongs to Bryant of Vermont, not Van Norman of Massachusetts. But the two stories are threads of the same rope. Van Norman had pioneered bearing race grinding back in 1914 and in 1972, the very year of the controversial sale. Van Norman's own precision centerless grinder line was sold off to Bryant. By the late 1970s, there was almost nothing left to sell. The industrial milling machine business was gone. What remained in Springfield was the automotive equipment line, the perfect O bars and flywheel grinders, and around 1979 Gulf and Western sold it, the fourth ownership change in 20 years. The buyer was Winona Tool Manufacturing of Minnesota, and observers understood that Winona was buying a world-famous brand name and a set of proven designs, not a unionized New England factory. The Springfield plant limped on briefly and closed for good in the mid-1980s. Multi-generation machinists, men whose fathers had earned the E Award pennant, watched the machines they had built and run be scrapped or trucked away. And somewhere in that closing, by the accounts of the enthusiasts who later went looking for them, a century of engineering drawings went into the dumpster where this story began. Van Norman was not alone. Of the 18 manufacturing firms that closed in Greater Springfield in the mid-1980s, all but 3 were union shops. The valley that taught America precision was being switched off, plant by plant. The brand survived through the automotive line. Winona combined its purchase with the famous name to become Winona Van Norman, which grew into one of North America's leading suppliers of engine rebuilding equipment and still operates today under LS Industries of Wichita, building flywheel grinders and boring equipment for heavy-duty engine shops. Around 2001, the Van Norman automotive remnants passed to the Quickway Company, itself a historic name in valve and cylinder equipment, and in 2013, Quickway became part of Iron Tight Products of Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Walk into a diesel rebuilding shop today, and you can still buy a brand new Van Norman flywheel grinder, a current FG 5000 or FG 10,000, carrying a nameplate first hung in Springfield a century ago, and the design philosophy is recognizably the old company's. The turntable rides on a generous cast bearing fed by a constant oiler, and the columns are chromed, precision ground, and lubricated from an internal wick, all of it arranged to keep load off the spindle bearings, which is exactly the kind of thinking Charles Van Norman was patenting in the 1920s. Somewhere in a corporate file in Iowa, the name of a Canadian watchmaker's family is still a going concern. The men fared worse than the brand. When the valley's plants closed, thousands of skilled metalworkers were pushed out of a trade that had taken each of them years of apprenticeship to enter, and the region's studies of what came next make grim reading. Machinists in their 50s took service jobs at a fraction of their old wages. Younger workers looked at the shuttered factories along the Connecticut River and stopped entering the trade at all. And with them went the apprenticeship chain, the unglamorous system by which a man who could scrape a machine way flat taught the next man to do it. Robert Forrent lived that history before he wrote it. He spent years as a machinist in Springfield's metalworking shops and served as an elected union business agent before becoming the historian of the valley's collapse, and his central finding lands hard. The skill did not fail. It was discarded by owners who could not put it on a balance sheet. But the more remarkable afterlife belongs to the old iron itself. In the decades since the plant closed, original Van Norman machines have become cult objects in the home machinist and restoration world. Hobbyists hunt number 12 and number 22 mills across auction sites, estate sales, and shop closeouts, and the finds have a ritual quality to them. What draws these people is exactly the set of qualities the company refused to compromise on: the mass of the castings, the hand-scraped ways, the rigidity that lets a machine from the Roosevelt administration still cut accurate steel in a garage today. One restorer's nickname for the type has stuck across the forums: the poor man's decal, a bargain path to the kind of convertible toolroom milling that European machines sell for 10 times the price. Even the company's old stubbornness became part of the culture. Those proprietary 5V and 50V collets, orphaned when the factory died, turned into prized and pricey tooling, with reproduction collet sets selling for around $175 and rare original overarm supports fetching $300 or more. So the community engineered around the problem, sharing drawings, machining their own collets, and in some cases, making entirely new spindles in standard tapers, doing for these machines what no owner had done for the company, refusing to let a solvable problem kill them. The automotive iron gets the same treatment. Old Perfecto boring bars are pulled from scrap yards and rebuilt bolt by bolt, and there is something quietly moving about the tutorials that circulate now. A veteran engine builder on camera in his home shop, walking a new generation through a machine older than his father, showing them how to center the bar in a worn cylinder, set the cat's paws against the wall, and take a clean 30-thousandths cut in a small block V8, exactly as a Springfield service manual described it 90 years ago. Over a century ago, a watchmaker's family scaled the most delicate craft in America into machines that helped win 2 world wars. Their workers, radicals the government never trusted, outproduced nearly every machine shop in the country when it counted. Their bearing grinders seeded a technology so critical it ended up in Senate hearings and nuclear strategy. Their designs echoed through tool rooms from Germany to Sweden, and their smallest mill became one of the most beloved machines ever put in front of an American machinist. And none of it, in the end, could survive a business culture that valued a quarter's earnings over a century of capability. Van Norman proves that American manufacturing did not simply lose to time or technology. It was liquidated, deliberately, one acquisition at a time, by owners who never once stood on the factory floor. But the dumpster got the drawings. It never got the machines. They are still out there, still cutting, outliving every corporation that owned them, which may be the only judgment that matters. If you made it this far, thank you. Subscribe to Trade Archive if you haven't already. And give the next video a watch. See you there.